share everything that I have with you today. My friends all day have been checking up on me saying, are you nervous? Like, how are you feeling? I was like, yes, I'm nervous, but I'm also incredibly excited because this is something that I've been working really hard on for the last 9 to 10 months, and something that I've spent countless hours daydreaming about, brainstorming, and trying to figure out. So the fact that I get to share with all of you, and all of you mean something to me individually. So I really appreciate your presence here. So thank you so much. And the thanks that Dr. Huffman said I'd probably be giving. Here it is. To all of my friends who have supported me through all of this, thank you so much. I couldn't have done it without you. To my family who's been there for me through everything. I'm really glad you guys could make it. All of the faculty of the side, you guys have led me along this journey. I would not be the person I am without you all. And to Dr. Huffman, thank you so much for your willingness to go on this adventure with me and teach me the ways that I needed to hear Elizabeth and just come to these sort of conclusions. It's been a great adventure. So thank you so much. So Elizabeth came to the throne as a very young woman, and she knew that she needed to adapt the language that was already present because there was no language of feminine rule. Just let that sink in for a minute. There was absolutely no precedent for any sort of rule of a woman sovereign like this. So she knew that if she wanted to actually reign and not just rule, not just be a figurehead, she needed to create these own areas for herself that she could express her role as part of her gender, but also transcend it in order to give herself the ability to rule in the way that she wanted to. Many scholars have debated what it was that made her able to do this. How did she manage to navigate this complex political situation for as long and successfully as she did? Specifically, what's the it factor that made her different than any other monarch, and did it have anything to do with her gender? I found in reading all of the scholars, and I did read quite a few of them, it seems that they came to one of two conclusions. The first one, and this is probably my lesser favorite of the two, was they just called her, they said, oh, she was just a woman. If she seemed like she couldn't make decisions, or she was too frustrated with people, they'd say, oh, she's just being a woman, and what can we expect? These tended to be the scholars that were written 1800s, 1900s, 1950s, all of those sorts of times. And to me, that's a really unsatisfactory sort of way of looking at it, because I think that does her a lot of discredit. But then the other alternative, which I think is sort of the gut reaction of feminists today, is they say, well, she wasn't enough of a woman. She wasn't a modern woman who would come in and change things for all women and live forever. And I don't think either of those really summarize her situation at all, because she couldn't have been a 21st century woman because there was no such thing. But for a lot of the older scholarship, she was just seen, she was disregarded as a woman who couldn't make decisions or any of those sorts of things. Most scholars seem to just pick one of the two of those sorts of camps. And I think that we have to be willing to understand that Elizabeth was different people at different times. And I don't know that that sounds a little weird to say she was different people, but I think mostly she understood her audiences enough to change her message, just enough to reach them. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about this presentation last night and talking through it in my head, we all do this. You probably have one sort of way that you interact with your immediate family members, probably a different way that you interact with your extended family at family reunions. Your coworkers, you have one sort of persona with them. Close friends, when you go out and do fun stuff with them. We're very used to doing this. We sort of section off our lives like this. And I think that scholars aren't willing to extend not the grace to see her in that way, but understand that that's a common way that we live, like that's part of human nature. And I think that by examining these different ways, we genuinely get to a good understanding of Elizabeth, and we see that she was a complex person and had the political and social and interpersonal intelligence to adapt to situations, and that's a tremendous gift that she had. So, my research has led me to this answer, sort of to that question of what the it factor was. I think that Elizabeth transcended, engaged, and ignored the restrictions of her gender at different times and different places as part of a rhetorical strategy to create public personae, yes, that is plural, for a reason, for herself, which did not fall within traditional gender expectations for women. And her tactics, or a combination, depended upon her audience's expectations, their relationship with her, and the intended outcome of the dialogue. She found the agenda of her audience and was able to speak to it. So in all of these, I'm going to show you how I broke down my research in just a minute. But I looked at her speeches, letters, prayers, and poems. I looked at genre and audience and purpose and rhetorical tropes and all those sorts of things. And a lot of times this picture looks like it has a lot of contradictions. But I think that's how Elizabeth chose to operate. And so I'm actually going to show you the picture. So the pearls, for instance, would symbolize rigidity. So you sort of see there the mother of the nation image, which is one of the ones that she worked really hard to portray. Here, she's got a globe, and her right hand is resting over North America. This is showing her a desire, her desire to actually rule and play a big part in international politics and affairs, which would necessarily coincide with the mother of the country image. Then, and I don't know, I'm going to get into this a little bit more later, but this portrait was painted after the disaster of the Spanish Armada. So the Spanish were the main Catholic presence in Europe at this time. They were not interested in getting along with England at all, so they sent a fleet of ships to invade England's shores. That's what you see on the left-hand side here. On the right-hand side, and it's really dark, I apologize, but there's something some scholars have called the Protestant wind, which it was basically just a storm that was sent and wrecked the entire fleet of ships so that England was never invaded. So this portrait was painted after that point. And down here in the lower right-hand corner is a mermaid. And mermaids typically signified feminine wiles, and they would lead to shipwrecks because mermaids, would call in sailors and then their ships would sink. So we see this very interesting, strong female warrior image coming out too, which contradicts several of the others that are in this. And I just think that's how Elizabeth chose to operate. I think that everything that's in this portrait is intentional, and the ways in which they don't align are intentional as well. So that's sort of just a screenshot, a snapshot, excuse me, of what I was looking at overall. So in order to study Elizabeth's correspondence and other writings, I chose to break down her audience into 5 different groups. And these roughly moved from most personal and closest to Elizabeth. They're all public in the sense that they're all literature intended for more of a public audience. They're not personal documents, but the court would be people closest to her, and then roughly moving farther out. So foreign dignitaries, I mostly looked at her correspondence to King James I of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, and Catherine de Medici. The bishops were the bishops of the Church of England. Parliament, straightforward, and then the public. So I found that under each of these headings, I could find trends that led me to understand all of the information within each group in a specific way. She used very specific rhetorical strategies for each one. So we're just going to jump in and start at the beginning here. This is Elizabeth at her court. And this is the one I think that was most interesting for me because these were people that she interacted with on a daily basis. Politics, especially at this time, and I don't know that this has ever changed, honestly, were very much based around friendly interactions. So it's the people who see politics of personal involvement in every aspect of her government. So in a lot of the correspondence that we have for this group, not a lot has been written down. If you think about what would have been written, it just comprises a very minute percentage of all the government dealings. But what we do have shows that she was highly intelligent, practical, observant, ruthlessly demanding, unafraid, classically educated, a really brilliant and interesting, multifaceted person. And in this group, I think her primary goal was she knew that she needed to assert her personal involvement in every aspect of her government in order to stay relevant. And this not only applied to policy. In order to make the best policy, she needed to be informed. That makes sense and would have applied whether she was a king or a queen. But if she had not chosen to demand to be at the center of attention, as any male ruler would have done, she would have gotten passed over and ignored, and all of her nobles would have worked around her and left her out. And this was really difficult for me, encountering this in the scholarship, because many scholars criticized her for saying how much she inserted herself and how much she was bold and said what she thought. And that, in my mind, this is a true double standard. This is how any ruler would have behaved, and yet because she was female, it was seen in a really negative light, and I don't think that's fair to her at all. I have a few quotes up here from a few letters. I will read these in a moment, so you can read them if you wish, but this was her whole desire and necessity for staying in the center of politics and being personally informed was most difficult when her nobleman needed to go off to war. Because she was a woman, she didn't have the same sort of role in military involvement that a king would have. So she stayed back at court, but that meant that she often wasn't at the center of decisions that were being made, and this really frustrated her. Part of that was just based on communication at the time. There was no way of communicating rapidly. And so part of that, I think, is just a fault of the era in which they lived. Letters took a very long time to arrive, and if a decision needed to be made, there was no way to get back to home base and let her in on that decision. However, she did not give them the space, she made it very clear that she didn't like this arrangement, I guess I should say. If she had said, okay, you go off, you handle this, they would have taken that authority and run with it and never given it back to her. So she needed to make sure that even in these situations where her nobles were not physically in her presence, that they understood that their allegiance was to her. So, and she knew she needed to create the kind of respect that a male leader would have had. So the first example is a little bit more of a harsh one. It's to Sir John Farrell in 1586. Let us have no more such rash, unadvised journeys without good ground. I know you do nothing but with a good intent for my service, but yet take better heed ere you use us so again. We don't have the context for the specific decision that she's criticizing here, but she's making it very obvious that she feels used by this nobleman's interactions and that she's reminding him of his responsibility to her. And I just think she manages to phrase it in a way that's tactful, but still very, very strong. She's coming across in a very slightly demanding way. Then the second one, I think, still shows that she's not quite pleased with how things are going, but she knows that she needs to balance criticism with a lot of appreciation, because that's how it's best to reach people. So, Sir Francis Drake and Sir John Hawkins. No doubting that you will think that if we do not much rely upon your faith, valor, and judgment, we would not commit to you so great a charge, and especially in such a time. She knew she couldn't take advantage of these people either or take them for granted. They were what made her government function, and she relied upon them. So I think that she was really good at being able to balance corrections with strongly rooted, genuine care for her kingdom and the people around her. There were a lot of letters that remain of good wishes and condolences that she sent to women in her court who had lost a loved one in war or something like that. So I think that we see Elizabeth's ability, and this must have taken a lot of work and a lot of day-to-day effort to keep everything centered around her, because if she did not, she would have lost all authority in her own kingdom, and that was the last thing that she wanted. Trust and loyalty are what Elizabeth most valued. This is really obvious when you read through her prayers and poems, the things she's talking about God protecting her from, and the traits that she says she most values in others are trust and loyalty, which make a great deal of sense if you know a lot of Elizabeth's context. She was never intended to rule. She was ferried around between all of these different houses, particularly when her sister Mary was reigning, because Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth, we see, eventually was Protestant. And so she was used to living in a very unstable, shifting sort of ground. And the fact that she was able to assert her responsibility and prerogative to rule in a situation like this with so many men says a lot for her character. And the fact that they, quite frankly, I don't know how to phrase this any better, but the fact that they worked with her for so long shows that it was effectual. And I think that's really, really admirable. So, the next group that we have here, I'm just going to go back to the portrait so we can look at that again, is that of foreign dignitaries. And most of what we have in this group are letters that Elizabeth wrote to all sorts of different monarchs. As I mentioned, I mostly looked at ones to James I of Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Catherine de Medici. And I think the first thing that you need to know about this group is that all of these people were related. And this is a common characteristic of European politics in general. Everyone was related to everybody else because somebody married somebody else's son, and then went off to wherever. So all of these people were very intimately connected to each other. And so you have the rapport and mutual respect and friendship already, because these are members of your family. And in those sorts of situations, you don't have to create or manufacture a relationship with these people because it already exists in some sort of way. These were people that she had tight interactions with. And reading through these letters, I recognized, and it really hit me in a very powerful way, that this was the only time Elizabeth spoke to her equals. Every other time she was speaking to people who were lower than her in England's hierarchy, this was the time that if she wanted to, she could be most frank with people because she knew that they understood the power of authority and what it was like to try to manage a kingdom and what it was like to have national interests behind you and need to make best decisions for your society and your people. She didn't have any need to downplay her role. And also, in this situation, we have letters that she wrote to members of her court who were female, but this is the only time she had any interaction with female rulers. And I don't really have time to go into it today, and I wish that I did because it's fascinating, but in her letters to Mary, Queen of Scots in particular, because we have a lot of them, we see how Elizabeth's language toward her own gender, meaning Elizabeth, what she called herself, and the ways that she referred to Mary definitely varied, and they changed over time, and as Mary was eventually participated in more plots against Elizabeth's life, she grew a lot more critical of the whole gender piece, which is fascinating. I don't have time to go into that, but suffice it to say that Elizabeth got to speak with female rulers, and that was really important because if you want to know what she thought about her gender, this is the best place to look in these foreign dignitary sort of category. Right, dear brother, your gladsome acceptance of my offered amity, together with the desire you seem to have engraven in your mind to make Merit's correspondent, makes me in full opinion that some enemies to our goodwill shall lose much travel. Several things I want to point out here. First off, in that very first clause, your gladsome acceptance of my offered amity, she's pointing out the friendship that she has toward James and sort of insisting on his friendship back to her. She emphasizes the reciprocity of this relationship. And she makes it very clear that she considers England's interests as synonymous with Scotland's, which I think is a really difficult thing to do. To try to convince somebody that your interests are the same as theirs is not easy to do, and yet she was able to balance it in such a way that it seemed natural. And I think that took a lot of work on her part. These people played active roles in the politics of their nations. They held genuine positions of power. They understood each other's positions so effectively and so intrinsically that they could speak in the confident language of an insider. So they used elevated language, but they also grounded it then with this language of family. So I think it manages to toe the line between really public documents interspersed with really personal relationship. These weren't private letters, but they managed to combine these two aspects of their lives in really brilliant ways. And I think that this does a lot for Elizabeth's credit in how she was able to interact with foreign leaders. So there we go. That's the first two audience groups done. So this next one signifies a really big jump for me from these first two. In these first categories, she has a personal interaction with the people. She has not necessarily a good relationship, but typically a working relationship with the people she's writing to. They know her, and she knows them. For the category of bishops, Elizabeth, there's a very high likelihood that Elizabeth did not have a personal working relationship with a lot of these people. She was familiar with them and comfortable. They were members of her court, but she was speaking to a body of people who did not necessarily have as close a knowledge of her as the other people had. So she needed to move away from personal rhetoric and move into more of a, not professional, but more of a public setting. Scholars have written ad infinitum about Elizabeth's personal religious beliefs. What were they? Did she have them? Where did they fall? And I read a lot about this, but I did not have time to go into that, except to understand what Elizabeth's conception of her role in the church was and what that thus meant for the bishops. Because if we're going to understand her audience, we need to know how Elizabeth viewed them. So, Elizabeth believed that her role in the church was to facilitate order preeminently and to stop the sort of widespread and popular reform of the church that had happened. It had gone from a Catholic community under the beginning of Henry VIII's reign to a very moderately Protestant, sort of in between situation after Henry VIII split from the Catholic Church. Then Edward was a very ardent Protestant. Mary was known as Bloody Mary because she persecuted all the Protestants. She was very Catholic. She married King Philip of Spain, who was Mr. Catholic in Europe pretty much at that point. And then he died, and that left her in a really interesting place because she could have gone either way. And a lot of the Protestants had fled to Europe. When she came to the throne, many of them came back, and they came back from Geneva with all of these ideas of Calvinism and all these great ideas they wanted to implement. And Elizabeth really was not interested in having any of it. She wanted her people to, she didn't want to examine their consciences. There's a really famous quote about this that I didn't cite because we don't have, there's a good chance it was not actually said by Elizabeth, but she was not interested in examining people's consciences. She wanted to create order, and she just wanted there to be some semblance of everybody following the same system. And in order to do that, there needed to be a system. And she wanted her bishops to be informed and educated, who could prepare priests to provide teaching across England. That was pretty much everything that she was expecting of them for. So she wouldn't suffer the abuse of the institution that the Protestants sort of threw at the bishops, but she didn't shy away from reprimanding the bishops because a lot of them possibly came from old Catholic families who had been there since her father's reign. Some of them were influenced more by the sentiments in the House of Commons, the people who were interested in Calvinism. And she wanted just the bishops to be with her and on her side and willing to help enforce this environment of unity in England. So, this first quote was actually taken from a conversation about the succession in Parliament, but it really brilliantly sums up, I think, what Elizabeth's perception of her role as Supreme Governor of the Church was. Taking up the point that the lives of her subjects were in danger from uncertainty about the succession, she proposed that they would merely lose their lives, whereas she would have to answer to God if she made the wrong decision. This is the sort of respect that she had for her position, and she knew that she had a responsibility of God to do the best thing, and so was not willing to take any slack from people who were not fully on board with her and willing to comply with her requests. Then, this is from a speech that she gave in 1559, and I think you guys, if you're interested, can read the beginning part. It's kind of long. But this part in the bold here, when she's calling out some of the advisors for being people who promoted schisms and heresies and stirred up the subjects against the true faith, I think is powerful because at this time, this is difficult, especially for, I think, us as Americans to understand, but conceptualize. But there was absolutely no separation between church and state. They were absolutely synonymous, and I think that means that she wasn't overstepping her bounds by trying to play a role in religion. This was her royal prerogative. And honestly, if you look at any of the religious upheavals that were occurring in Europe at this point, most of the time when people were persecuted, they were persecuted under charges of treason and not heresy, because they were going against the government. And I think if you see it through that lens, Elizabeth's view for the bishops makes sense. If they're going against what she and her God-given role, her view of the church and her vision for it, and if they were just more focused on complying to local standards and not enforcing this sort of uniformity, it was her duty to call them out. And I think she did, and she was not interested in creating a religious and cultural environment in the church that was responding to grassroots trends or looking for innovation. She was traditional in her practices, but did not approach anywhere near the levels of subscription to particular dogma that her brother or her sister had advocated, and I think that says a lot about her. So, there's one quote in here that I did not get the chance to throw in, but we're gonna see how well I remember for you guys because it's phenomenal. It's a one-sentence long letter that she wrote to the Bishop of Ely, and she basically says that if he does not follow the rules that she has given him, she says, I will unfrock you by God. You know what you were before I made you who you are. I will unfrock you by God. It's really funny, but it shows how serious she is about this. And I don't think that again, needs to be read as her overstepping her bounds. This was accepted as what her authority was, and she was willing to live up to it. And that really means a lot. So, I'm going to go now to the fourth audience group, which was Parliament. And this one was very tricky for me personally, because even more than this bishop's group, she is moving to a lot of rhetoric that was playing into pre-existing tropes. These were not people that she had a personal interaction with. Parliament was, for all purposes, the most powerful men's club in the kingdom. They were not interested in having a female ruler. They were not interested necessarily in working with her in a lot of things. And she only called Parliament. It was not a continually standing institution. She needed to call Parliament, and she called it very few times in her reign, only when she needed money for taxation, because taxes also did not exist at all times. She needed to institute them when she needed money for, war or something like that. So she called Parliament rarely, because when she called them, they saw it as an opportunity to air all of their grievances, talk about all the things they disliked, and she really was not interested in that, particularly because they had a tremendous fondness for bringing up questions of her marriage, her succession, and religion. And all of those she viewed as her royal prerogative. Which, if you think about it, so if she married, hopefully, she'd produce an heir. That was the whole problem with all of the Tudors, since ever. There's the succession question as well. She needed an heir to continue ruling England. She said that these things were her prerogative, and effectively in doing that, she was saying that her opinion, as the queen, as a woman, was more important than all of their insight, which she argued was her royal prerogative. And quite frankly, perhaps they didn't have as much of a right to bring these things up as they wanted to believe. She reminded them that their traditional right to freedom of speech was only to be directed to the agenda items that she brought forth and she was interested in discussing. And it only extended to the physical borders of Parliament and until the end of that parliamentary session. So she, in this situation though, if she would have said, well, okay, probably at the beginning of her reign she considered marriage. It's easy for us to look back and say, oh, she probably never considered it because it didn't end up happening. I personally believe that she probably strongly considered marriage at several different times, but if she was in a situation and they were saying you need to get married, and she did not have any immediate prospects or things weren't looking that way for her, if she flat out denied them, they would have gotten infuriated. They would have begun looking for their own successor among themselves, and she would have very probably been overthrown. That's the truth. There were enough plots against her life as it was without them having really good figureheads. So she needed to make sure that her audience understood that she was listening to them and she understood their concerns and knew what was going on, but she needed to actually promise nothing. So through assurances and platitudes and sort of talking around the issues, she made it very clear, this is my prerogative. I will do something on this when I think it's necessary. I appreciate your concern, but please go, ratify these taxes for me so I can send you guys home. That was what she wanted from them. So, let's look at some quotes here. So this is part of a speech that she gave in 1586 when she's discussing the role of Mary Queen of Scots in an attempt on her life. And this is really fascinating to me, and I won't go through the trouble of reading the whole thing because I like it. Find out, here's some things I want you to look for. Her discussions of her mercy, her discussions of her love for her people and her people's love for her, and the role that God gave her to rule England. So, yet I do not thank God for that, nor for all the rest so much as for this, that after 28 years' reign, I do not perceive any diminution in my subjects' good love and affection towards me. This is the thing I most joy in, and that wherein I take my greatest comfort, without which I would not desire to live. But together with this, my greatest joy, I conceive no small grief that there should be some within my realm, of mine own subjects, found so wicked and disloyal as that they should seek to take away my life, and most of all, that one of my own sex, state, and kin should be consenting thereunto. I thank God such disloyal subjects are but few. I am sure I have the hearts and good wills of the greater part. This is kind of a sobering moment for Elizabeth because she's recognizing that one of the female rulers that she had a really tight interaction with and tight bonds, and she constantly exhorted to take the higher road in some situations, and use sort of the conceptions and theories of politics that Elizabeth was using, Mary chose to go along with this plot against Elizabeth's life. And so this does not necessarily bring up the marriage or the succession that I talked about, but I think this shows how she needed to, a lot of these were formal statements, and she needed to make some sort of statement about the situation and frame it in more rhetoric, perhaps, than we see in different audience groups that were closer to her person. But she's really just emphasizing her role, sort of in this one particular, as the mother of the nation. And that took a lot to do, particularly in groups like Parliament that were based around so many men that she could not possibly manage the expectations that everybody had of her. She didn't aim to persuade her audience. Peter Mack has a really wonderful quote about this. He says, there wasn't any pressure on her to persuade her audience. She did, though, prefer to charm them so as to lessen any resentment of her deferral of action. I have dozens of examples. If you'd like to see, they're all in the resource room down there because I brought all of my primary sources down. But I think she just was very wise in how she chose to approach a lot of these things, and this discussion of a plot against her life is no exception. So, we have one last audience group, and this one we get to read some of the Tilbury speech, which Dr. Huffman brought up. That was really funny. Because I was actually going to say something similar to what he said. So, we'll get to that. So, the public. I'm going to put these quotes up first. So, she used a tremendous number of rhetorical strategies. If you can restrain yourselves, don't read it yet. I know that's really difficult. I'm just going to put it up. But we'll get to it. Her speeches happened in times of great national crisis. They weren't very long, the speeches themselves. She needed to bolster public morale, emphasize loyalty, issue a call to service. They weren't necessarily fact-based or informative, meaning, in my opinion, you can't really read into them too much to understand Elizabeth's beliefs on anything, apart from her loyalty to England or all of that. But you don't need these necessarily to have a great nuanced opinion of how she conceived her own gender and leadership or anything like that. So she needed to be directly responsible for making the public feel heard, reassured, in a very small amount of space on the first try. And this is difficult to do. I think we can all think of speeches perhaps that we've heard in a history class or in our lifetimes of politicians that really succeeded, and then other ones that you might not remember because there was nothing extraordinary about them. And several of the speeches that we have with Elizabeth to the public that remain are incredibly powerful and bolstering and emphasize, again, as in the speeches to Parliament, mutual respect and love, the loyal hearts and goodwill of her subjects, credits to God for her throne, her dedication and intentionality, and all of those sorts of things. She needed to, especially with the public, a lot of these people didn't know her. They might have known because there was very much less news and communication as there is today. They might have not known much about her at all. And so she needed to play into their conceptions of her gender enough so that they feel understood. If she had gone and completely ignored all of perhaps the negative perceptions that people had about her, they would have just said, oh yeah, but, you know, X, Y, and Z. If she said, oh yeah, you know, I know what you're thinking. I know that you're probably, you know, a little concerned or judging me for being a woman because of these things. But if I spin them to my advantage and make it look like I understand, but I'm surpassing them, then your concerns are taken away. And she showed brilliance for being able to do this. So, without further ado, here's an excerpt from the Tilbury speech. My loving people, I have been persuaded by some that are careful of my safety to take heed how I committed myself to armed multitudes. She's talking to the armies who are ready to face the Armada. This is before they were all shipwrecked, so they're facing a huge sort of army coming at their shores for fear of the treachery. But I tell you that I would not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and goodwill of my subjects. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Every time, like I just can't help it. It's beautiful. And this is just one of the examples. But I think that she manages, like she says, body of a weak and feeble woman. She is there just talking to the armies when they're used to having a king addressing them with all, you know, the martial might and power that a king would be trying to, and can give to his armies in a situation like this. But she's saying she has the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England. And that does not put her in any of a disadvantaged position talking to them, and that she can inspire them and give them the same sort of strength and courage that a king would have in this situation. And that's powerful. There's a reason that this is one of the things that we have. And so while the Armada situation managed to go down really well for the English, and they didn't actually need to fight at all, I don't know, this is one of the things that initially inspired me. So I really wanted to include that as well. So I think through this you can see that she's kind of telling her audience how they feel and reiterating it to them and showing her gratitude, and she's just being that virgin warrior queen that she knew she could be. So I'm going to close with a quote that I actually have at the beginning of my paper that chose to put at the end of my presentation. And I picked it because I think that it really summarizes how much Elizabeth knew that everything she was doing was fulfilling a role. I really love it. Princes, you know, stand upon stages so that their actions are viewed and beheld of all men. And I am sure that my doings will come to the scanning of many fine wits, not only within the realm, but in foreign countries. First off, she's calling herself a prince, which is really interesting. But she's basically saying she knows that everything that she does is going to be closely analyzed and discussed, and that a judgment of her is going to come off of it. And I think that this is just another example of how Elizabeth was adept at finding her audience, finding them where they were, and going to them, and then taking them where she wanted them to be. And I think that's brilliant. It facilitated her ability to be a queen and rule as long as she did. Without this, she would have not been able to speak to her people. They would not have been interested in her being their ruler, and she probably would have gotten overthrown, quite frankly. So I think this quote summarizes her view of her role and her perception. And honestly, you all, by being here today, and I thank you again, you are some of those many fine wits who have been scanning what she did. So she foretold you all sitting here. That's what I'd like to think. So thank you so much for coming out.
We always like to have time for Q&A. That stands for question and answer. Clear. That's part of our custom. So we continue the dialogue. Oftentimes things you see that you, she moved on. So you have a question to follow up on that. So any questions? Students first, by the way.
Yes. I'm curious about whether you came across any examples where she took a misstep or addressed her audience wrongly, or what she did to work around that.
That's an excellent point. I think there were situations that she probably did the people around her a disservice by, especially in matters relating to her court and the people who were around her, that she probably facilitated within them. She probably created some sort of discontent. I think that she needed to be as bold as she was, but the very fact that these were powerful men of England who were receiving this harsh of a reprimand from a woman didn't sit well with them. I think she absolutely needed to do it. I think it was overall effective, but I know if you look at her interactions with specific courtiers over the years, because she reigned so long, they definitely went through periods where they were more in her favor, less in her favor, and more happy and less happy about the situation. So I think that's the main example that comes to mind. I think for things like her public speeches and stuff, most of them are more carefully orchestrated because they're less honest. So I think when she got more honest, there was the potential that people would be unhappy, but she did what she had to do.
Have you looked into why she's not wearing a crown in the painting and how it's kind of set off to the side?
No, I was actually just thinking about that last night. I did not extensively study this. It mostly came up when we needed a portrait for the poster. But then I looked at it, I know, it's stupid. But I looked at it and I was like, there are so many things here. Dr. Hoffman was pointing out. I was like, this plays into everything so well. So I'll use that as an introduction. Do you have anything
I just say a couple
to say?
things. If you look closely on top of her, she does have a kind of little mini tiara
It's a
there.
little tiara.
The coronation crown was always more powerful as a symbol off of your head. When you wore it on certain days, like high holy days. And so to set it out there as a symbol, made it clear you were the state, if you will. You were more than just it being on you, but it was a symbol of who you were. So I think that's probably the intention there. I think it's also very important that it's not your head and slide it right above the globe. Because friends, that is a statement, we're entering into, we're empire makers too. It's not just the Spanish and Americans. So that's a creepy little hand going down in the Americas and the crown's right above it. So I think there were intentions for why it's not there. Other questions?
Do you think some of her hesitancy to marry had anything to do with, obviously, the tumultuous marriages that her father had, and the fact that her own mother was killed by her father for not producing, an heir? I can't imagine that wouldn't have an effect on her. And obviously, she saw that her sister was kind of ruled, by her husband.
Yeah.
And so I just didn't know, maybe stumbled upon anything that kind of confirmed that.
First off, it's really hard to find any situations that she talked about her personal intentions behind anything. I don't know if she kept a diary, so I'm sure scholars would kill to have it, but we certainly haven't found one yet. So I think you're right. I think that absolutely played a large role in her perception of family and marriage. I don't know that there's any way it could not have. But there are several times when she strongly considers marriage, when she comes very close to the agreed situations. She flirts with people and courts people and facilitates this sort of situation around her where she is seen as somebody who's interested in marriage and wants to be courted. So I think the fact that she did have that situation around her and she did appear open to it might show that she was able to move past her family's history, but I don't know if the fact that she didn't ever end up actually making up much had anything to do with it. Or just was situational, because it could be either things.
I understand that she was very literate, and I was wondering which particular writers she looked to for her rhetorical models.
That's a fantastic question. She was very classically educated in her youth. She was not groomed for the throne, but she received a phenomenal classical education. I was reading some things that she translated, I think it was from Ovid, and she certainly read all of the greats as far as rhetorical strategy went. She knew many languages and would translate pieces as a child for her sort of authority figures as gifts and send them to them. So I don't know specifically what she drew from individual authors, but any of the classical artists, authors and artists that would have played a major role in a good education at this point, she certainly encountered all of them. So I didn't go so far as to say, oh, she probably got this usage of whatever from this author, because I didn't have time to do that. But yeah, if you can think of any of those people, she would have encountered them. She was very well educated.
Others too.
Cassy, I love that last quote. It's powerful in lots of ways. Such awareness, perception of the rhetorical moment.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question that bounces off of that. It's a little unfair, right? I realize the difficulty of sources here, and there's lots of questions for which we don't have sources. But I'll even take a guess. How do you think? Any hints, any instincts, any sort of partial sources on the other side of the rhetorical relationship, on the reception of it?
Mm-hmm.
How are her words, I suppose, than her actions, how are they viewed and beheld and heard of all men and women? These interesting groups that you walk us through. I think all of them, if I'm remembering, or most of them, having both male and female members within them. Any thoughts of how this very carefully calibrated rhetorical approach is heard and responded to?
That's a great question, and yeah, the first thing I have to say is it's the source problem.
Yeah.
There's a reason we have her words, and that's
Sure.
because she's
Right.
the queen.
Right.
Talking more in an incidental way, which was interesting for me, it's easy enough to read her words and say, oh yeah, these are the standards that she wanted to live up to, and this was the sort of person she wanted to be. And then when you look sort of at just the politics of her era, and how she managed to work with people, the only thing that I have to say, really in a concrete way that we can recognize, is that all of the people in England, for the most part, did work with her. She had an excellent relationship with a lot of the people that she did politics with. And with the very sad exception in the foreign dignitaries of Mary, who ended up being beheaded for her role in plots against Elizabeth's life, save for James, their relationship went up and down over the years, and yet he eventually was her successor, and they had a really good relationship leading up to the years that she would eventually die and he took over. So I think that we can see that she was very well respected, and that these people took her at her word because she was so confident in that situation. Beyond that, beyond seeing the respect that she could definitely create in order to have a fruitful and pretty stable political environment for decades, I think that says a lot beyond that. I wish there's more, but there isn't anything.
We have time for one more question. All right, well, I know Cassy is more than happy to keep talking about Elizabeth. So thank you all for coming. Let's graduate one more time.